It started with something so small, I almost dismissed it. Jessica's wedding ring was missing from her finger. I noticed it one quiet Tuesday evening while I was chopping bell peppers for dinner. She sat at the kitchen island, scrolling on her phone like usual, her left hand resting casually on the countertop. It wasn't unusual for her to remove the ring. She'd always said it felt tight after a long day, but tonight its absence felt different. "Where's your ring?" I asked, aiming for a light, offhand tone. She glanced at her hand as if only noticing it herself. Her green eyes flickered, but her response came quickly. "Oh, I must have left it in the bathroom after my shower," she said, flashing me an easy smile. Her explanation seemed reasonable, but something in her delivery made my stomach tighten. A little too casual, a little too rehearsed. We sat down to eat, and while Jessica scrolled through her emails, I couldn't stop glancing at her hand. It was just a ring, just a piece of metal, I told myself. But wasn't it more than that? Wasn't it a symbol of us? By the next morning, I couldn't let it go. As Jessica slept soundly beside me, I got up to look for the ring. First the bathroom counter, then her bedside jewelry tray. Nothing. I even checked the drawer where she kept her accessories. Still nothing. Maybe she'd put it somewhere I wouldn't think to look. Or maybe it wasn't misplaced at all. That evening, she came home late, the scent of her new floral perfume preceding her as she walked in. "Long day?" I asked as she set her bag down. She nodded, grabbing a sparkling water from the fridge. "Endless meetings," she replied. It was a harmless answer, but her tone carried a distance I couldn't ignore. The tension was subtle, like a thin film over everything she said. She asked about my day, but it felt obligatory, like she was crossing off a box. And the ring? Still missing. Over the next few days, I started to notice more things. The way she kept her phone close, closer than usual. How she tilted the screen away when I entered the room, or how she'd quickly switch apps. I even caught her smiling at a text once, a smile that wasn't meant for me. "Jess," I said one night as she scrolled through her phone on the couch. "Doesn't your wedding ring fit anymore?" Her reaction was quick, too quick. "What?" "Your ring," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I haven't seen it in days." "Oh," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Work's been hectic. I guess I've just been forgetting to put it on." She smiled at me, but her smile wasn't the same. Not the soft, warm one I'd fallen in love with 9 years ago. This one felt like a mask, paper-thin and fragile. For the first time in our marriage, I felt the weight of doubt pressing on my chest. That night, after Jessica fell asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the little moments, the missing ring, the guarded phone, the faint smell of a cologne that wasn't mine clinging to her jacket the other night. By morning, I knew I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. I needed answers. The following Saturday, I woke up early, determined to put my unease to rest, or confirm it. Jessica was still in bed, her face serene and peaceful in sleep. It almost made me hesitate. Almost. After grabbing a cup of coffee, I sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. Jessica rarely used it for personal things anymore, relying on her phone for everything, but it still synced to our shared email. I knew her password, one of those shared relics of trust from years ago. I told myself I wasn't crossing a line. If everything was fine, she'd never know. But if it wasn't, her inbox was a mix of newsletters, work correspondence, and the usual spam. I skimmed the subject lines quickly, feeling both relieved and foolish. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it was just a ring, a stressful job, and my own insecurities. Then I saw it, an email buried among the clutter, innocuous at first glance. Friday night reservation confirmed. Bistro 83. The sender was some automated booking system. Curiosity prickled at me. Bistro 83 wasn't just any restaurant. It was upscale, intimate, the kind of place where couples celebrated anniversaries. We hadn't been there in years. I clicked the email. The reservation was for two, made the previous Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. The same night she'd said she was working late. My chest tightened. I leaned back in my chair, replaying that night in my head. Jessica had come home around 10, claiming the office had been swamped. She even mentioned eating takeout with her coworkers. But this was a lie. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Was this it? Proof? Or just a misunderstanding? Maybe she'd gone with a client or a friend. I clung to that thought, desperate to rationalize it. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. I closed the laptop and glanced at the clock. Jessica was still asleep upstairs, oblivious to the storm brewing in my mind. My first instinct was to wake her, to shove the email in her face and demand an explanation. But I stopped myself. No, not yet. I needed more. That afternoon, while Jessica was out running errands, I searched the house. Not frantically, but methodically. I checked her coat pockets, her dresser drawers, even the glove compartment of her car. It felt wrong, invasive, but my instincts wouldn't let me stop. Eventually I found it. Tucked into the back pocket of her work tote was a small, folded receipt. Bistro 83. 2 entrees, 1 dessert, and a $150 total. Her signature was scrawled neatly at the bottom. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. I clutched the receipt, my breathing shallow. This wasn't just a reservation. This was proof. I sank into the couch, staring at the slip of paper in my hand. My thoughts spun wildly, colliding and breaking apart. Who was she with? How long had this been going on? And the most painful question of all, why hadn't I seen it sooner? Later that evening, Jessica came home, her face lit up with the casual warmth that once felt genuine but now felt rehearsed. She kissed me on the cheek and set down a bag of groceries. "Hey babe, what did you get up to today?" "Not much," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "We had dinner, watched TV, and went to bed, all while the receipt burned a hole in my pocket." I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed time to think, to plan my next move. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling as Jessica's steady breathing filled the silence. My mind churned with possibilities, a part of me hoping I was wrong, the other part readying for war. Because now it wasn't just suspicion. Now I knew something was wrong. The next few days were agony. I was trapped in my own mind, every smile, every laugh from Jessica now tainted by doubt. Her phone was always within reach, clutched like a lifeline, and I started noticing patterns. Texts late at night, muted notifications, quick glances at her screen followed by a flicker of tension in her face. It was becoming unbearable. I needed to know the truth. Not just fragments, but the full picture. On Thursday evening, while Jessica was in the shower, I finally gave in. Her phone was on the bedside table, screen dark, beckoning me like an unspoken dare. My hands shook as I picked it up, hoping her passcode hadn't changed. It hadn't. The moment the screen unlocked, I was plunged into her world. Messages, social media, emails. I scrolled through her texts first, my heart hammering in my chest. Most were ordinary, conversations with coworkers, reminders from her boss, but then I saw the name, Mark W. I tapped the thread, my pulse roaring in my ears. His messages weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. "Had a great time Friday," one read, followed by a winking emoji. Another, sent just the day before, said, "Can't stop thinking about you." Her replies were just as damning. "Me too," she'd written. "Wish we could have had more time together." More time together. My stomach twisted into knots. I scrolled further, my hands trembling, and found photos. Nothing graphic, but there she was, Jessica, sitting at a dimly lit restaurant booth, a glass of red wine in hand. Another shot of her laughing, her face glowing with the kind of joy she hadn't shown around me in months. The timestamps confirmed it. Bistro 83, last Friday. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, then sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bathroom door. The sound of running water filled the room, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding like a war drum. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smiling at her phone, laughing with Mark, living a life I wasn't part of. My mind spun through scenarios, a kaleidoscope of rage, heartbreak, and humiliation. By morning, I knew I couldn't let this fester. I needed control, a way to confront her that wouldn't let her wriggle out of the truth. On Saturday, I called an old friend, Eric. We'd grown up together, but life had pulled us in different directions. Eric now worked as a private investigator. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but when I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. "Leave it to me," he said. "I'll give you what you need." We met that afternoon at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Eric was calm and methodical, jotting down notes as I shared everything I discovered. Texts, photos, a dinner receipt. Sounds like you've already got a lot, he said. But if you want airtight proof, I'll dig deeper. Give me a week. I nodded, feeling a small flicker of relief. For the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't drowning. That evening, Jessica and I went out to dinner. It was her suggestion, a spur-of-the-moment plan that felt more like damage control than genuine affection. She dressed up, wearing the black dress I'd always loved on her, and plastered on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've been so quiet lately," she said as we waited for our food. "Is everything okay?" Her question caught me off guard. Was she genuinely concerned? Or was this guilt, seeping through the cracks of her carefully maintained facade? "I'm fine," I said, my voice even. "Just work stuff." Her smile softened, and for a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. When we got home, I waited for her to fall asleep before slipping out of bed. I poured myself a drink and sat at the dining room table, staring at the faint reflection of the moonlight in the glass. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about certainty, because once I had the truth, I wouldn't just confront her. I'd make sure everyone saw her for who she really was. The next week crawled by like molasses, each day heavier than the last. I went through the motions at work, hammering nails, measuring boards, and nodding absently at my crew's chatter. But my mind was elsewhere. Every time my phone buzzed, my pulse quickened, hoping it was Eric with an update. Jessica, meanwhile, seemed oblivious. Her routine stayed the same: late nights, guarded texts, smiles that felt like cheap imitations of the real thing. She kissed me goodbye every morning, but it felt hollow, like she was kissing a mask instead of a man. By Thursday, Eric called. "Meet me at my office. Tonight." I left work early, telling Jessica I had to help a friend with a project. She barely asked questions, another detail that stung. Eric's office was in a nondescript building downtown, the kind of place you wouldn't look at twice. When I walked in, he was waiting for me with a file in hand, his expression grim but professional. "I've got it," he said, sliding the folder across his desk. Inside were photos, clear, damning, undeniable. Jessica and Mark at Bistro 83, leaning close, her hand on his. Another of them leaving a hotel together, his arm draped casually over her shoulder. A series of texts printed out, including one where she called him my escape. My stomach churned as I flipped through the evidence, each image and message chipping away at whatever hope I'd clung to. Eric cleared his throat. "This wasn't just a one-time thing, man. They've been meeting for months. Hotels, dinners, even your house once while you were at work." The room spun. "At my house?" Eric nodded. "I didn't want to tell you, but you needed to know. There's more, too. I got his info. Mark Wesson. He's married. Wife's name is Natalie." That caught me off guard. He wasn't just wrecking my marriage, he was wrecking his own. "What do you want to do?" Eric asked, his tone careful. I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing, filled with equal parts rage and strategy. The evidence was everything I needed, but I couldn't just confront Jessica. "Not yet. I need time to think," I finally said, sliding the folder back to him. "Keep it safe for now." Eric nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself, James." That night, I couldn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly for hours, winding through back roads until the stars dotted the sky. The images Eric had shown me replayed in my mind, each one like a knife to the chest. When I finally pulled into the driveway, it was nearly midnight. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room TV. Jessica was curled up on the couch, asleep under a blanket. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. But I knew better now. I went upstairs, showered, and crawled into bed. She came up an hour later, slipping under the covers without a word. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her lies pressing down on me. The next morning I called in sick to work. I needed to clear my head and plan my next move. Jessica left the house around 9, claiming she had back-to-back client meetings. I waited until her car disappeared down the street before grabbing my phone. It was time to call Natalie. I found her number in Eric's file. Dialing, it felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. When she answered, her voice was soft, almost timid. "Hello." "Natalie, this is going to sound strange, but my name is James. I think we need to talk about your husband." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, sharp and shallow, before she finally said, "Mark?" "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "He's been seeing my wife." I expected her to hang up or lash out, but instead, she exhaled shakily. "I knew it," she whispered. "I've had my suspicions for months, but hearing it from someone else." I told her about the photos, the messages, and the hotel. She listened in stunned silence, occasionally murmuring, "I can't believe this." When I was done, she thanked me, her voice stronger now. "He won't get away with this. Neither will she." "We'll make sure of that," I said. For the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. By the time Jessica got home that evening, I'd made up my mind. The confrontation was coming, but it wasn't going to be a private affair. Jessica and Mark wouldn't just face me. They'd face everyone. But first, I needed one more piece of the puzzle. Something Jessica couldn't deny, no matter how hard she tried. Because when I confronted her, it wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be the end. I spent the next few days preparing. Every detail mattered. This wasn't just about exposing Jessica and Mark. It was about taking control, reclaiming my dignity, and ensuring they couldn't spin their way out of the truth. I coordinated with Natalie, who was just as determined to see Mark held accountable. Together, we agreed on the timing. A dinner party Jessica and I were hosting the following Saturday. It was a small gathering, just some close friends and a few of Jessica's co-workers. It was perfect, intimate enough to confront her without an immediate escape, but public enough to ensure the truth couldn't be hidden. Natalie would arrive unannounced, and Eric would be nearby, ready to present the evidence if things got messy. In the meantime, I kept up appearances. I acted normal, or at least as close to normal as I could manage. Jessica didn't suspect a thing. She even seemed chipper, probably thinking she'd gotten away with whatever scraps of lies she'd thrown my way. When Saturday arrived, I woke up early, pacing the house while Jessica prepped for the evening. She floated around the kitchen in a whirlwind of activity, humming softly to herself. "You're quiet," she said, glancing at me. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a small smile. She gave me a quick peck on the cheek, her mood annoyingly bright. "Well, get some rest before the guests arrive. Tonight's going to be fun." For her, maybe. By 7 p.m., the house was buzzing with conversation. Jessica was in her element, laughing and mingling as if she didn't have a care in the world. I stood in the corner, nursing a glass of bourbon, my eyes tracking her every move. Mark hadn't arrived yet, but I knew he'd come. Jessica had mentioned offhandedly that she'd invited a few colleagues, and the look in her eyes told me exactly who she hoped to see. At 7:30, he walked in. Mark was the kind of guy who thought he owned every room he entered. Broad shoulders, easy smile, and an air of arrogance that made my skin crawl. Jessica lit up the moment she saw him, her hand brushing his arm as she greeted him. I gripped my glass tighter, forcing myself to stay calm. The dinner went smoothly on the surface, a facade of normalcy. I played the polite host, but inside, I was counting down the minutes until Natalie's arrival. At 8:15, the doorbell rang. Jessica glanced at me, puzzled. "Are we expecting someone else?" "No," I said, standing. "I'll get it." When I opened the door, Natalie was there, dressed sharply and holding her head high. She looked me in the eye, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then, with a small nod, she stepped inside. The room went quiet as Natalie entered. Jessica's smile faltered, confusion clouding her face. Mark, on the other hand, froze, his expression a mix of shock and panic. "Natalie," Jessica said, forcing a smile. "What are you doing here?" Natalie didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at Mark, her gaze cold and cutting. "I'm here because I thought it was time we had a little honesty in the room." I stepped forward, my voice calm but loud enough to command the attention of everyone present. "Jessica, Mark," I said, "I think it's time we talked about what's really been going on." Jessica's eyes darted to me, then back to Natalie. "James, what is this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "It's the truth, Jess," I replied, pulling out the folder Eric had given me. I placed it on the table, opening it so the photos and printed messages were visible to everyone. The room erupted in whispers and gasps as our friends leaned in to see the evidence. Jessica's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she stared at the incriminating photos. Mark tried to speak, but Natalie cut him off. "Save it, Mark. We all know what you've been doing." Jessica turned to me, tears welling in her eyes. "James, I can explain." "Don't," I said sharply, my voice breaking. "You don't get to explain. You lied to me, Jess. You betrayed everything we built." Her tears fell freely now, but I didn't feel pity, just anger and a hollow ache where my love for her used to be. Mark, desperate to salvage his image, stammered something about misunderstandings, but Natalie silenced him with a withering glare. "Don't insult everyone's intelligence, Mark." The confrontation didn't last long. Jessica tried to apologize, but her words rang hollow, drowned out by the weight of her actions. Mark left in a huff, dragging Natalie with him, though I knew she wasn't done with him yet. The rest of the guests trickled out soon after, offering awkward goodbyes and sympathetic glances. By the time the house was empty, Jessica and I stood alone in the wreckage of our marriage. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I laughed bitterly. "It didn't have to go anywhere, Jess. But you made your choice." She didn't respond. For once, there was nothing left for her to say. That night, I slept in the guest room, the folder of evidence still sitting on the dining room table. I wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but one thing was clear. My life with Jessica was over. And this time, I was the one walking away. The morning after the dinner party was eerily silent. Jessica's presence lingered like a shadow, but she wasn't in the kitchen, the living room, or anywhere else I looked. Her car was still in the driveway, but I realized she hadn't slept in our bed or the guest room where I'd stayed. I found her outside, sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket with a mug of coffee clutched in her hands. Her eyes were puffy, her face pale. She didn't look up when I stepped outside. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. There was no script for this. No guide for untangling nearly a decade of marriage after such a betrayal. Finally, she broke the silence. "How long have you known?" Her voice was quiet, almost childlike. "Long enough," I said, my tone flat. "Does it matter?" She nodded faintly, her gaze fixed on the mug. I need to understand how we got here." I wanted to laugh, or yell, or both. Instead, I leaned against the porch railing, letting the cold morning air bite at my skin. "You tell me, Jess. You're the one who stepped out." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they didn't move me. I'd seen enough tears to last a lifetime. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she murmured. "I never meant to hurt you." "Funny," I said, shaking my head. "You didn't seem too worried about hurting me when you were with him. In my house. At our table." She flinched at that, her face crumpling. But still, no apology. The rest of the weekend passed in fragments. Jessica retreated to the guest room, emerging only to grab food or coffee before disappearing again. I spent most of my time in the garage, tinkering with old tools I hadn't touched in years, trying to drown out the noise in my head. By Monday, I'd made my decision. I came home from work to find Jessica in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. She didn't look up as I walked in, but her shoulders tensed when I cleared my throat. "We need to talk," I said. She muted the TV and turned to me, her expression wary. "I want you out of the house by the end of the week." Her jaw dropped slightly, but she didn't respond right away. "James, where am I supposed to go?" "I don't know," I said bluntly. "You can figure it out. Stay with a friend. Rent a place. But you can't stay here." She blinked rapidly, as if trying to process my words. "You can't just throw me out," she said, her voice trembling. "Why not? You threw us away the second you let Mark into our lives." Her face twisted with a mix of guilt and anger. "It wasn't like that." "Don't," I interrupted sharply. "Don't try to explain it away. You don't get to justify what you did." For a moment, I thought she might argue, but instead, she deflated, sinking deeper into the couch. "Fine," she said quietly. "I'll leave." The next few days were a blur of packing and strained silence. Jessica boxed up her clothes, her books, her personal belongings, while I avoided the house as much as possible. Natalie called once during the week to check in. She'd served Mark with divorce papers the day after the dinner party and was moving forward with full custody of their 2 kids. We commiserated briefly, but I found little comfort in knowing Mark was getting what he deserved. By Friday evening, Jessica was gone. She left behind a note on the kitchen counter, scrawled in her hurried, messy handwriting. James, I'm sorry for everything. I know you'll never forgive me, but I hope one day you can find peace. You deserve better than I ever gave you. For a moment, I just stared at the note, unsure of what I felt. Anger? Relief? Sadness? In the end, I folded it neatly and put it in the trash. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat on the back porch, staring out at the dark expanse of the yard. The house felt impossibly quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I thought about everything Jessica had said, about how she hadn't meant for things to get so far, how she hadn't meant to hurt me. But intentions didn't matter. Choices did, and she'd made hers. Now it was time for me to make mine. For the first time in years, the house felt empty. Not just quieter, but hollow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension and betrayal and finally exhaled. Jessica was gone, and so was the weight of pretending everything was fine. That first weekend, I didn't know what to do with myself. I spent hours cleaning, scrubbing countertops, mopping floors, boxing up the little remnants of Jessica that she'd left behind. A stray hairbrush in the bathroom, a scarf tossed over the back of a chair. Each item felt like a shard of glass under my skin, a reminder of what was and would never be again. But the cleaning helped. Every swipe of a cloth, every trip to the trash felt like a small step toward reclaiming my space and my life. On Sunday afternoon, Eric called. "How you holding up?" he asked. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out at the backyard. "It's quiet," I said. "Weirdly quiet." "That's not a bad thing," Eric replied. "Quiet's where you start figuring things out." I appreciated his sentiment, but figuring things out seemed far away. Right now, I just felt untethered. "There's something else," Eric said after a pause. "Natalie wanted me to pass along a message. She's hosting a small gathering this weekend and thought you might want to come. Low-key. Just a few people." The idea of socializing made my stomach turn, but I also knew isolation wasn't the answer. "Yeah," I said after a moment. "Tell her I'll be there." The following Saturday, I found myself standing outside Natalie's house, an unassuming two-story tucked into a quiet neighborhood. I hadn't seen her since the dinner party, and part of me felt awkward about walking into her life again. But when she opened the door, her smile was warm and genuine. "James," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Thanks for coming." Inside, a small group of people mingled in the living room, chatting over glasses of wine and plates of hors d'oeuvres. Natalie introduced me to a few friends, most of them neighbors or co-workers, and within minutes, I felt surprisingly at ease. Natalie was a natural host, effortlessly keeping conversations flowing. But what struck me most was how calm she seemed, considering the chaos Mark had left in her life. She carried herself with a quiet strength that I couldn't help but admire. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned out, Natalie and I found ourselves sitting in her backyard, the faint glow of string lights casting soft shadows over the patio. "Thanks for inviting me," I said, swirling the last of my drink in my glass. I wasn't sure if I was ready for, well, anything like this. She smiled faintly. "It's hard, isn't it? Letting people back in." "Yeah." I hesitated, then asked, "How are you holding up?" "After everything." She leaned back in her chair, looking up at the stars. "Some days are better than others, but I'm getting there." She turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "What about you?" I shrugged, still figuring it out. "It's hard to even know where to start." "You start small," she said simply. "One thing at a time." Her words stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I took her advice to heart. I started focusing on the little things, cooking real meals instead of eating takeout, going for runs in the mornings, picking up a woodworking project I'd abandoned months ago. Each task felt like a tiny victory, a reminder that my life didn't have to stop because Jessica had betrayed me. Natalie and I stayed in touch, mostly through texts and occasional phone calls. She was easy to talk to, and though neither of us mentioned it, I think we both knew we were leaning on each other more than we let on. One evening, as I sanded the edges of a table I was building in the garage, my phone buzzed with a text from her. "You free this weekend? There's a farmer's market downtown I've been meaning to check out. Thought you might like it too." I stared at the screen for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Yeah, I typed back. I'd like that. The following Saturday morning, I met Natalie at the farmer's market. It was bustling with life, stalls filled with fresh produce, handmade crafts, and the smell of baked bread mingling with freshly brewed coffee. Natalie spotted me first, waving from a stand selling wildflower bouquets. She had her hair tied back in a loose braid and wore a casual sundress, her smile bright and effortless. "Didn't take you for a farmer's market kind of guy," she teased as I approached. I chuckled. Figured it's time to try new things. We wandered through the market together, stopping to taste samples and browse the stalls. It was easy, natural, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about Jessica. At one point, Natalie held up a jar of honey, turning it over to inspect the label. "You ever use this for woodworking?" "Beeswax, sure," I said. "Never honey." She grinned. "Maybe you should try. Could give your projects a sweeter finish." I groaned at the pun, but I couldn't help smiling. After the market, we grabbed coffee at a small cafe nearby. The conversation flowed easily, from light banter about bad puns to deeper topics. How she was handling life after Mark, how I was adjusting to the silence of an empty house. "Do you miss her?" she asked suddenly, her tone gentle but direct. I paused, staring into my coffee. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not the person she became. I think I miss the idea of her. Of us." Natalie nodded. "It's hard to let go of what you thought your life was going to be." "Yeah," I said softly. "But it's getting easier." As the weeks went on, Natalie and I started spending more time together. It wasn't planned exactly, it just happened. A phone call to vent about a tough day turned into an invitation for dinner. A chance meeting at the hardware store turned into an afternoon spent assembling furniture for her guest room. She had a way of making things feel lighter, like the world wasn't such a heavy place after all. And I realized I liked being around her, not just because she understood what I'd been through, but because she made me want to look forward, not back. One evening, about a month after the farmer's market, I invited her over to my house for dinner. It was the first time she'd been there since Jessica moved out, and I felt a strange mix of nerves and anticipation as I watched her walk through the door. "You've been busy," she said, glancing around the living room. I'd replaced the old curtains, repainted the walls, and rearranged the furniture, small changes that made the house feel like mine again. "It's a work in progress," I said, scratching the back of my neck. She smiled. "Aren't we all?" After dinner, we sat on the back porch, sipping wine as the sun dipped below the horizon. The conversation ebbed and flowed, and for a while, we just sat in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies blink in the yard. At some point, Natalie turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about starting over? I mean, really starting over?" I looked at her, the weight of her question settling between us. "Sometimes," I said, "but it's scary, you know? Letting go of everything you thought your life would be and trying to build something new." She nodded, her gaze steady. "It is, but maybe that's how you grow." Something about the way she said it hit me like a quiet revelation. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face it alone. A few weeks after that evening on the porch, Natalie and I found ourselves walking along the riverfront, a quiet trail lined with oaks and maples whose leaves were beginning to turn. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, and the sound of water lapping against the shore filled the pauses in our conversation. This wasn't like the night spent talking about Jessica or Mark or the pain we'd both endured. It wasn't about the past at all. We talked about lighter things, places we wanted to visit, hobbies we wanted to pick up, dreams we'd shelved for far too long. At one point, Natalie stopped to admire the river, her hair catching the golden glow of the setting sun. "I used to come here all the time," she said, her voice soft. "It's peaceful, isn't it?" "It is," I said, watching her more than the view. For a moment, I thought about reaching for her hand, but I hesitated, unsure if I was ready or if she was. Instead, I said, "Thanks for this." "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like to just enjoy something again." She smiled, and I felt something shift between us, quiet and unspoken, but undeniable. That night, I stayed up late working on the table I'd started weeks ago. It was almost finished now, a sturdy oak dining table, simple but solid. As I sanded the edges and wiped away the dust, I realized I wasn't just making furniture. I was building something new, something that reflected the person I was becoming. I thought about what Natalie had said on the porch. Maybe that's how you grow. She was right. The old me. The man who'd ignored the warning signs in his marriage, who'd let himself shrink into the background of his own life, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone willing to face the hard truths and keep moving forward. The next weekend, I invited Natalie over for dinner again. This time, I used the new table. I didn't tell her I'd made it until she ran her fingers along the wood, admiring the craftsmanship. "You built this?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Yeah," I said, feeling a little sheepish. "It's not perfect, but—" "It's beautiful," she interrupted, smiling. "It's perfect." Her words stayed with me through dinner, through the wine we drank on the porch, and through the quiet, lingering goodbye at the door. A few days later, Natalie texted me, "Want to help me pick out some paint this weekend?" Thinking of giving the guest room a new look. I stared at the message, the hint of something deeper hiding behind her words. This wasn't just about paint or walls. It was about building a future, one step at a time. "Sure," I typed back, my fingers hovering over the screen before I added, "What color are you thinking?" Her reply came almost instantly, something bold, maybe a little unexpected. I smiled, thinking about how much had changed in the past few months. Bold and unexpected sounded just about perfect. A month later, I found myself driving out to a small park Jessica and I used to visit when we first got married. It wasn't planned. I was in the area for work and decided to stop. The place was quieter than I remembered, the trees taller, the paths more overgrown. I sat on a bench near the pond where we used to feed the ducks, thinking about how much had changed. For the first time, I didn't feel bitterness or anger. I felt acceptance. Jessica's choices had shattered our marriage, but in their wake, I'd found something far more valuable, myself. The bench creaked as I shifted, pulling out the envelope I'd brought. Inside was the note Jessica had left when she moved out, along with a few photos from better times. For months, I kept them tucked away, unsure if I was ready to let go. But now it was time. I tore the note in half, then again, until the pieces were too small to reassemble. I tossed them into the nearby trash can, feeling a strange lightness settle over me. The photos were harder. I held them for a long moment, running my thumb over the edges before slipping them into the envelope and tucking it into my jacket. Some things weren't meant to be destroyed, just left behind. That evening, Natalie and I met at her house to finish painting the guest room. She'd chosen a deep teal, bold but soothing, just as she described. As we worked, we talked about everything and nothing. She told me about a pottery class she was thinking of taking. I told her about a new client who wanted custom cabinets for their kitchen. When the walls were done, we sat on the floor, surrounded by paint cans and brushes, sipping beers and admiring our work. "You think it's too much?" she asked, gesturing to the color. "Not at all," I said. "It's unexpected, in the best way." She smiled, and for a moment, we just sat there, the silence warm and comfortable. "James," she said softly, turning to face me, "do you ever think about what's next? For you, I mean?" I met her gaze, feeling the weight of the question. "I do," I said, "and honestly, I think I'm ready for it." Her smile widened, and she leaned back against the freshly painted wall, her eyes bright with something that felt like hope. The weeks turned into months, and life began to take on a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Natalie and I grew closer, though neither of us rushed things. We didn't need to. The connection we shared wasn't about filling a void. It was about building something real, something lasting. One evening, we drove out to the riverfront trail again, this time with a picnic basket in tow. As we sat on a blanket, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized how far I'd come. The pain of Jessica's betrayal no longer felt like an open wound. It was still there, a scar that would always remind me of what I'd endured, but it no longer defined me. Natalie shifted beside me, her hand brushing mine. When I looked at her, she smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that seemed to say, "We're going to be okay." And for the first time, I believed it. Months later, I finished my next big project, a custom dining table for Natalie. It was even better than the first, with intricate details carved into the legs and a smooth, polished surface that gleamed in the sunlight. When I brought it to her house, She ran her fingers over the wood, her eyes lighting up. "It's beautiful," she said. "Thank you." "It's for us," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. She looked at me, her expression softening. "Us?" "Yeah," I said, taking a deep breath. "If you're ready for that." Her smile was all the answer I needed.